Most people watching the headlines thought this was a story about Venezuela or about Donald Trump or about yet another skirmish in the endless culture war that now surrounds every foreign policy decision. But that is not really what this was about. What happened here was a small but revealing moment about political leadership, coalition management, and moral clarity, and it told us far more about Canada's governing class than it did about Caracas or Washington. Here is the surface-level story you already know. The United States carried out an operation that resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, a man widely regarded across democratic governments as an illegitimate ruler who presided over systematic repression, electoral fraud, corruption, and the collapse of a once functional state. Shortly afterward, Canada's Prime Minister issued a statement. That statement condemned Maduro's record, affirmed support for democracy, praised international law, and spoke vaguely about multilateral engagement and peaceful transitions. It did not mention the United States. It did not mention the operation. It did not express approval or disapproval of how Maduro was removed. It was, in form and substance, an exercise in studied ambiguity. If you read it quickly, you might think it was unobjectionable. After all, who opposes democracy, human rights, or peaceful outcomes? But politics is not a graduate seminar in abstract values. It is the art of choosing. And what mattered here was not what the statement said, but what it conspicuously avoided saying. In moments like this, neutrality is not neutral. It is a decision to evade responsibility. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the incentives shaping Canadian politics right now. The governing coalition is not a unified philosophical project. It is a stitched-together arrangement of voters with sharply different instincts about power, markets, and America. Some see Donald Trump as an existential threat whose every action must be reflexively condemned. Others, especially those tied to trade, finance, and energy, may dislike his style but care deeply about outcomes and stability. Leadership in such a coalition requires either persuasion or prioritization. What it cannot survive on indefinitely is evasion. The Prime Minister chose evasion. Instead of acknowledging that something decisive had happened, instead of explaining how Canada understands the balance between sovereignty and accountability, instead of telling citizens why this moment fits or does not fit our principles, he produced language that could have been released almost any year, under almost any circumstances. It was timeless in the worst way, detached from events as they actually unfolded. You might be tempted to dismiss this as mere communication strategy. But this is where institutions quietly weaken. Democracies depend on leaders who can explain why certain actions, however uncomfortable, are justified, and why others are not. When governments retreat into generic formulations to avoid offending factions within their own base, they train citizens to expect nothing more than moral wallpaper. Over time, voters stop listening not because they are cynical, but because they are being given nothing to engage with. What made this episode especially telling was the contrast. Opposition leaders were willing to take a position knowing full well it would anger some voters. That is not recklessness. That is accountability. It allows citizens to agree or disagree, to reward or punish. A statement that offends no one also instructs no one. This is not about applauding any foreign leader as a hero, nor is it about endorsing every tool of American power. It is about whether elected officials can still speak plainly when reality intrudes on theory. Dictators rarely leave office because of carefully worded communiques. They leave because pressure is applied, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes controversially, but decisively. As a viewer, you should care about this because the habit of non-commitment does not stay confined to foreign policy. It migrates. It shows up in trade disputes, in national security, in economic shocks. A government that cannot tell you what it thinks when the stakes are obvious will struggle to tell you the truth when the stakes are murkier. And that is the deeper story hiding beneath a statement that tried very hard to say nothing at all. There is also a deeper misunderstanding at work here about how legitimacy functions in the modern international system. We often speak as though legitimacy is a matter of tone, process, and properly footnoted resolutions, when in reality it rests on a combination of consent and enforcement. Maduro lost consent years ago. Elections that are neither free nor fair do not confer authority, no matter how many times they are staged. At that point, legitimacy becomes a question of whether the international community is willing to treat reality as real. When leaders pretend that a negotiated transition is always available, even after every avenue has been closed by the regime itself, they are not being principled. They are being evasive. You could hear this evasion in the phrasing about peaceful processes and multilateral engagement. Those words sound humane, and often they are, but they can also become a refuge from judgment. Peaceful outcomes are desirable. Negotiated solutions are preferable. The question is what you do when the other side uses negotiations as a stalling tactic, when multilateral forums become graveyards for accountability, and when delay itself becomes a form of complicity. At some point, insisting on procedure over outcome ceases to be moral restraint and becomes moral abdication. This is where leadership is tested, not by whether you can recite the correct values, but by whether you can explain trade-offs honestly. You might believe the American operation set a dangerous precedent. If so, say that and defend it. You might believe it was a necessary intervention against a criminal regime. If so, say that and explain why it does not license chaos elsewhere. What corrodes trust is the refusal to choose either argument, combined with the assumption that citizens will mistake vagueness for wisdom. Coalition politics makes this temptation stronger, not weaker. When a party is held together by factions that share a ballot line but not a worldview, the path of least resistance is ambiguity. Over time, however, ambiguity becomes a habit, and habits harden into character. Voters notice. They may not articulate it in academic language, but they sense when leaders are managing optics rather than making judgments. That perception does more damage than any single controversial decision ever could. There is also an institutional cost. Canada's foreign policy credibility has traditionally rested on being predictable, not passive. Allies may disagree with us, but they have generally known where we stand. Statements like this erode that clarity. When partners cannot tell whether silence signals caution, disapproval, or indecision, they discount it altogether. The country becomes present in form but absent in influence. You can see how quickly this dynamic spills into domestic debate. Instead of arguing about principles, people argue about motives. Instead of asking whether a dictator's removal advances justice or stability, they argue about who is afraid of whom within a party coalition. That is a sign of politics hollowing out. Substance gives way to factional psychology. I want to be clear about something. None of this requires you to admire American presidents or to celebrate the use of power. Skepticism about force is healthy. Concern about precedent is legitimate. But skepticism only has value when it is paired with alternatives that are grounded in reality. Simply repeating that we support democracy does not explain how democracy is to be restored when it has already been destroyed. As a citizen, you are entitled to more than safe sentences. You are entitled to explanations. You are entitled to leaders who trust you enough to tell you why they think one course of action was right, wrong, or tragic, but necessary. When they refuse to do that, they are not protecting democracy. They are quietly teaching people that democracy no longer expects them to think seriously about power, responsibility, or consequence. This episode also illustrates how political calculations can overshadow moral clarity in the daily operations of government. The Prime Minister's coalition is not merely a collection of policy positions. It is a set of competing loyalties, ideological commitments, and voter sensitivities. One group despises Trump, seeing him as a destabilizing force. Another group tolerates him when results align with their economic interests. Managing this tension is undeniably tricky, but there is a difference between managing a coalition and avoiding responsibility altogether. What happened here was the latter. Consider the message he sent by omission. In a world where action speaks louder than words, failing to acknowledge the operation sends a subtle but powerful signal that procedural caution and internal coalition comfort outweigh the urgency of global justice and democratic accountability. It communicates to citizens that their leaders are more concerned with not offending factions at home than with holding an internationally recognized tyrant to account. That is not leadership. It is a form of passive governance that risks eroding both credibility and public trust. It's worth noting that this isn't unique to Canada. Democracies everywhere struggle when their leaders prioritize internal politics over coherent foreign policy. But the Canadian context is illustrative because of its coalition dynamics and the symbolic weight that foreign policy statements carry. When Trudeau's government, or any Canadian government, speaks, it is often read as a statement about values, not just strategy. Citizens, foreign partners, and even adversaries parse every word for intent, signal, and principle. That magnifies the consequences of ambiguity. Now let's step back and consider the mechanics of what actually occurred in Venezuela. Maduro's regime had entrenched itself through decades of corruption, manipulation of electoral mechanisms, and the use of state power to suppress dissent. Elections were consistently marred by irregularities, with credible international observers declaring them illegitimate. For the United States to carry out an operation that captures him and removes him from power without a single American casualty is, by any measure, extraordinary. The operation was surgical, precise, and designed to minimize collateral damage, which further underscores the missed opportunity for acknowledgement in Ottawa. Instead, the Prime Minister's statement read like a generic template designed for any crisis anywhere in the world. Words like multilateral engagement, democratic transition, and respect for sovereignty dominate the message, while the actual context, an unprecedented extrication of a criminal dictator, was effectively ignored. This is not only a political misstep, it is a failure to communicate competence and situational awareness. Citizens are left asking, if the government cannot clearly interpret such a clear-cut event, how can they be trusted to interpret more complex crises? This brings us to the broader question of credibility. Credibility in foreign policy is cumulative. Every statement, every decision, every vote contributes to a nation's reputation. When leaders hedge excessively, when they refuse to acknowledge success or even the significance of decisive action, they erode trust with allies and embolden adversaries. Allies become uncertain whether Canada will stand with them, and adversaries calculate that the government is more interested in optics than outcomes. That is a dangerous combination in a world where information and misinformation travels faster than any official statement can correct it. At the same time, we need to consider the domestic consequences. Political coalitions are fragile, and leaders who cannot navigate them decisively risk not just short-term criticism, but long-term erosion of their authority. By issuing a statement that seeks to offend no one, the Prime Minister effectively communicates that leadership is about minimizing dissent rather than advancing principles. This may appease the ride-or-die loyalists temporarily, but it alienates moderates and pragmatic voters who expect clarity, judgment, and moral backbone from their leaders. Over time, this style of cautious non-commitment can hollow out a party's base, leaving it susceptible to more disciplined opponents who are willing to articulate and defend positions. If you strip away the words and the talking points, the deeper lesson of this episode is structural. It is easier to be cautious than courageous, easier to say nothing than something decisive. And while evasion might appear politically safe in the short term, it gradually teaches both politicians and citizens to accept a lower standard of leadership. When leaders consistently avoid the hard calls, they normalize a political culture in which analysis is deferred, judgment is outsourced, and responsibility is diluted. Consider the feedback loop this creates. Citizens learn to expect only carefully calibrated statements. Media outlets, sensing that leadership will not offer clear guidance, pivot to speculation and commentary. Bureaucrats, observing hesitation at the top, become risk-averse. Over time, the machinery of government becomes more interested in managing perception than managing reality. Decisions that require moral courage, rapid judgment, or principled risk-taking are postponed or avoided. This is not a problem for a single statement. It is a problem for the entire system. Contrast that with moments when leaders do make a choice. Opposition figures, as noted earlier, may face immediate criticism for taking a stand, but they also define the terms of debate. They signal to citizens what values actually mean in practice, not just in theory. They show that the government can be held accountable and that citizens' expectations matter. This is why statements like Ottawa's non-committal communique are so corrosive. They reduce politics to aesthetics, turning moral clarity into a cosmetic exercise rather than an operational imperative. It also matters internationally. In global affairs, credibility is not a slogan. It is a pattern of behavior. Allies notice consistency. Adversaries notice vacillation. When a government refuses to name the significance of a major event, like the removal of Maduro, it inadvertently signals that Canada's alignment is negotiable, its values optional, its reactions dependent on domestic consensus rather than principle. In geopolitics, that is not cautious, it is weak. The ultimate consequence is cultural as much as political. Citizens internalize the message that moral language can be empty, that leadership can be neutralized by fear of internal dissent, and that complexity excuses avoidance. That lesson is far more dangerous than any single misstatement. It creates a population trained to accept a lower threshold of accountability and a government conditioned to offer it. The erosion is incremental, almost invisible, but cumulative and irreversible if uncorrected. The irony is that leadership often demands discomfort. Speaking plainly, especially when it risks offending factions within your coalition, is rarely popular. Yet history consistently rewards the leaders who articulate choices clearly, defend them, and face the consequences. Non-committal statements, by contrast, invite misinterpretation, fuel cynicism, and dilute authority. In a moment when Canada could have reaffirmed its values while recognizing a pivotal international event, it chose to step aside. This is not a partisan critique. It is an institutional one. The question is not whether Trudeau or any leader is ideologically correct in every judgment. The question is whether they can navigate reality without defaulting to safe language that conceals rather than clarifies. Leadership is not about avoiding mistakes. It is about guiding citizens through the unavoidable, sometimes morally ambiguous terrain of real-world politics. In the Maduro episode, Ottawa failed that test, not through malice, not even through incompetence, but through a habitual retreat from responsibility. In the end, the lesson extends beyond Venezuela or even foreign policy. It is a caution about political habits, about the slow erosion of clarity and trust, and about the subtle ways in which governments teach citizens what to expect and what not to expect from those they elect. Silence may feel like prudence. Neutrality may feel like wisdom. But in politics, evasion is never neutral. It is a choice, one with consequences that accumulate quietly but powerfully, shaping both the present and the future of governance. So what does responsible leadership look like in moments like these? How can a government restore credibility, rebuild public trust, and demonstrate that words, when used well, can match action? The answer is deceptively simple: clarity, courage, and context. Clarity means speaking plainly about events as they actually occur. When a foreign leader is captured, when a regime changes, when history turns on a precise moment of action, leaders owe citizens an honest account. This does not require cheerleading or blind endorsement. It does require naming the event, assessing its significance, and explaining the reasoning behind one's own stance. A statement that is precise but principled strengthens both democracy and international credibility. Citizens do not need spin, they need truth. Courage is about prioritizing principle over comfort. Coalition politics is difficult. Managing factions requires nuance. But nuance is not synonymous with non-commitment. Leaders must be willing to articulate positions that risk internal friction if those positions are consistent with the nation's values and interests. Taking a stand, even imperfectly, signals that leadership is about judgment, not just optics. Courage is contagious. It trains citizens to expect accountability, encourages civil discourse, and fosters a political culture where debate is substantive rather than performative. Context is essential for translating abstract values into practical guidance. Democracy, human rights, and sovereignty are not platitudes. They are operational challenges. When leaders provide context, explaining why an action was taken, what risks it entailed, and how it fits into a broader strategy, they equip citizens to understand the trade-offs inherent in governance. Context transforms words from moral wallpaper into instruments of comprehension and engagement. Beyond these principles, Canada must recognize the long-term consequences of habitual ambiguity. Each evasive statement chips away at institutional credibility, at public confidence, and at the country's influence on the global stage. Reversing this trend requires deliberate effort. Briefing citizens honestly, consulting allies openly, and demonstrating through both action and explanation that leadership is not synonymous with risk avoidance. Institutions can also help enforce clarity. Parliamentary oversight, independent analysis, and a free press are not mere formalities. They are mechanisms that hold leaders accountable when convenience tempts evasion. When these systems are engaged fully, leaders are encouraged to provide the transparency and reasoning that citizens deserve. Weak statements are tolerated less and scrutinized more, raising the bar for responsible governance. Finally, citizens themselves play a role. Expecting clarity, insisting on explanation, and rewarding honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, is part of sustaining a healthy democracy. Political courage is meaningless without a public willing to listen, understand, and engage. The lesson of the Maduro episode is not only for politicians, it is a call to the electorate to demand substance over style, judgment over optics. Canada's governing class can still recover from episodes like this, but only if it recognizes that leadership is tested not when events are convenient, but when they are complicated, controversial, and morally urgent. A statement that explains, defends, and contextualizes action builds trust. A statement that hides behind safe language erodes it. Over time, these choices define a nation's character, both at home and abroad. In the end, the true measure of leadership is not in avoiding offense. It is in guiding citizens through the realities of power with honesty, responsibility, and courage. Canada, like all democracies, will face such moments again. The question is whether it will respond with clarity and conviction, or continue the quiet abdication that has become too comfortable. History does not reward hesitation. It rewards leaders who speak, who choose, and who take responsibility for the consequences. That is the challenge and the opportunity facing Canadian politics today. The Maduro episode and Ottawa's response leaves us with a clear lesson. Leadership is measured not in generic statements, but in the willingness to confront reality, make judgments, and communicate them honestly. In politics, as in life, avoiding decisions does not make problems disappear. It merely postpones the reckoning and erodes trust along the way. Canada's governing class faces a simple but stark choice. It can continue to prioritize internal comfort over clarity, offering statements that soothe factions but leave citizens uncertain and allies guessing. Or it can embrace the harder path, provide explanation, accept risk, and articulate principles in concrete terms. The first path may feel safe in the short term, but it hollowing out authority and credibility over the long term. The second path demands courage, but it is the only one that sustains both democratic engagement and international respect. The broader truth is that clarity, courage, and accountability are contagious. When leaders model them, citizens learn to expect them, bureaucracies internalize them, partners respect them. When leaders avoid them, hesitation becomes habit, and hesitation becomes a defining characteristic of governance itself. The Prime Minister's statement about Maduro may have seemed minor at the time, but it is part of a pattern with consequences far beyond a single foreign policy moment. For Canada and for any democracy, the solution is not to react to every event with zeal or partisanship, but to respond with judgment, to name reality, assess it, and communicate choices transparently, to balance coalition interests without sacrificing principles, to recognize that leadership is about more than managing appearances. It is about guiding a nation through complexity with integrity. If Ottawa or any government can learn this lesson, it can restore the trust that episodic evasions slowly corrode. If it cannot, the cost will be both domestic and international. A citizenry trained to expect moral wallpaper, allies uncertain of commitments, and a political culture that rewards non-commitment over courage. The Maduro episode ends not with a simple critique of a single statement, but with a challenge. It asks whether Canadian leaders, and by extension citizens, are willing to insist on a standard of accountability, clarity, and courage that matches the realities of power. That is the ultimate measure of democratic health, and it is the standard that will determine whether Canada's governance is remembered for its character or its convenience. Leadership is never neutral. Silence is always a choice. The question is whether, in the moments that matter, Canada will continue to choose wisely.